G'day everyone. Back to another one of our big questions as we continue through the story of some of the questions that you have sent in. And someone has sent this one in. They would like to know more about the doctrine of predestination. If God already knows who will follow him and who won't, it doesn't seem fair to exclude someone who may be genuinely seeking the truth. Thank you to whoever put that one in. It's an interesting one, isn't it? And I have no idea. And so we've got a person today. Ockert Meyer is one of the lecturers at the Theological College. Ockert, welcome.
Thanks, Richard. Good to be with you.
So, predestination. It's one of those really good debates that the church has along the way. How do we answer this question?
So it is indeed one of those questions that one gets, every now and again. It's interesting. I mean, it's been some time since I've heard the question. I know when I started in ministry, it was a question that was often, offered to me. And so one of the benefits of having a question, often put to you is that you delve a little bit deeper in it. And so over the years, and depending on who asked the question, my answer will sort of, vary as well. But sort of in terms of the way that you've put it, I think it's, let me give you a little bit of background, because I think that is helpful to understand the context of predestination and the way that it was used in the church. So the idea of predestination, of course, is a biblical idea, but it is sort of spread across the Bible. The place where we see it most, perhaps most explicitly articulated is in the letter to the Ephesians. Now, central to this letter is the great mystery of God's eternal love for humankind that was revealed in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, so speaking about the church, Paul says that the evidence of this eternal love of God is found in the fact in chapter 1, verse 4, that God has chosen us, that's the church, in Christ. And then he uses the words, before the foundation of the world. The same idea is then repeated in verse 11, where he says, in Christ we also have obtained an inheritance, and then using the words, having been destined according to the purpose of him who accomplishes all things according to his counsel and will. So the important thing there is the word destined. Now, the Greek word that is used here actually means predestined. So that's where the idea of predestination comes from.
Okay.
So what he basically says is he's speaking to the universal church. So at that point, of course, by the time Paul or whoever wrote the letter to the Ephesians, the church was spreading across the ancient world, and so he's speaking to the worldwide church, and saying that God had chosen or identified them, and then these wonderful words, even before the creation of the world for a specific purpose. So that's basically biblically spoken where the idea of predestination comes from. Now, what is incredibly important here is that even though it is something that comes from the Bible, the moment you speak to a Roman Catholic person, you will know that they either completely reject it or never speak about it. In the Anglican Church, you find sort of a combination of these two things. Either people, just reject it out of hand, or if they're sort of more reformed-minded, you will find the same idea for that. But of course, there are good reasons, and this is at the heart of understanding predestination as it is used in the church as a doctrine today, and especially in the Reformed churches. And so the moment one asks those type of questions that your questioner has asked, then it raises all kinds of questions. So if God had chosen for us, then I mean, what's the purpose of our faith? If God has already chosen us before we had faith, why do we still need to have faith?
It does take our choice out of it a little bit, doesn't it, really?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So logically spoken, that is exactly what happens. So, and of course, there are deeper problems than that. Does it mean then that God has chosen some and rejected others? Or does it mean that the gospel of Jesus Christ is then good news for some people and bad news for other people? So
it gives you that real comfort of knowing that I am chosen by God. God has chosen me. But if you think about it deeply enough, then it actually ends up saying, but God has destined some people not to be chosen. And
exactly.
that sort of adds a rather awkward side to it.
That adds a very bad, and so a very bad tone to it. And that's why it is important to understand exactly where it comes from and how it is supposed to be used. Because the moment one sort of looks at it sort of, so surgically, so clinically, those are the logical consequences of it. But of course, as I've already sort of suggested, there's something more to it. And the first thing about this more to it is the historical context in which the whole idea of the predestination was sort of first offered in the church and became a kind of doctrine. Because and that is important, because before the Reformation, one would never have really heard of predestination. So the whole doctrine of predestination really is something that comes from the Reformed period and is most closely associated with the life of Calvin. So, and Calvin, as we know, was a minister in three, Swiss centers: Basel, Strasbourg, and Geneva, and all of these places were big refugee centers. So that's very important. So between 1550 and 1562, so that's about 12 years, it is said that Geneva received more than 7,000 refugees. Now, wow. that was in a city of about 10,000 people. So that means more than half, or almost more than half of the city's population would have been refugees.
What was happening? What were they escaping from?
Religious persecution.
Wow.
So that's really important. So as you can imagine, the moment, I mean, you see the same thing, or one has seen the same thing happening in Germany, after the Syrian influx of 3-4 years ago, and there was only a million refugees out of a population of almost 80 million. And so you see the same thing saw the same thing in France. So this rapid increase in the refugee population caused a lot of xenophobia. So even before the greatest influx of refugees, there came a call among the Swiss people, that among the local population, that all Frenchmen should be thrown in the Rhone River. And so these French immigrants were also blamed for the cost of living. And by 1654, they said, sometimes these immigrants or refugees were attacked on the streets because people said that they were taking their jobs. So very much the same things that,
sounds like Australian politics at the moment. Yeah.
Well, it shows you, if you know history, it's the eternal repetition of things.
Wow.
So the important thing, the size of Calvin's congregation in Geneva was between 500 and 600 people, and all of them were refugees. And to a large extent, that was true of Calvin himself. So they had nothing. They were deprived of their own story, deprived of their past, deprived of their future, deprived of their identity and self-worth. And so the really remarkable thing is that it was in the stories of the Bible, and especially in passages like these, that they discovered a story that echoed their own and an identity that, that raised their hope. So Heiko Obermann, a famous Reformation historian, at a certain point talks about this. And he gives a really beautiful sort of summary of what happened here. So he said, for those who had no permanent place of residence, not even a fixed stone on which to lay their heads, neither a valid passport nor a residence permit, predestination became their identity card.
So our identity, like we talk about our identity in Christ, but if you were in that kind of deprived situation, you can understand your identity solely existing in Christ.
Absolutely. So because there was nothing left for them, they found their identity in Christ. And so what became at the heart of that was God's election, predestination, in other words, was proclaimed to those who had no expectation in them of themselves and no hope in themselves. So who could only despair of their own situation, their own faith, their own destiny, and all of these things. So, in other words, what happened in terms of when Calvin sort of proclaimed the idea of predestination, it was not to tell people who were already Christians or who already had everything, you were chosen by God before time. It was to people who lost all hope, who thought that God had forgotten about them.
How were they reading the scriptures well? Absolutely,
and that is exactly the point. So for people who have no hope beyond the scriptures, what they do is they read the scriptures way more intensely. And so this idea of God that had chosen for us before we choose God is a very biblical idea, but it's something that already comes from the Old Testament. So to a certain extent, the Old Testament is saturated with that. I mean, the whole identity and existence of Israel is based on the fact that God had chosen for them before they had chosen God. And that was the one thing that separated Israel from the surrounding nations as well. And that's why, when the prophets speak to the pagan nations, to the Gentile nation, you can go out and choose your own God. But that was not true for the Israelites. They couldn't choose their God because their God had already chosen for them before they had chosen God. So predestination links up with that truth. And so basically predestination or eternal election means just one thing, and that is that God loved us before we loved God. It is God's grace preceding our birth and even preceding our new birth. And it means, therefore, that our identity, and that's what happened in Calvin's time, but that's also true for us as Christians today, that our identity and our destiny is anchored in God's love and not in the first for us, and not in the first place in our love for God or in our faith in God.
So would it be fair to say from what you're saying here that we are all chosen, and the thing is whether we choose to accept our chosenness? Would that be a reasonable no?
Well, so I'll come back to that specific. Well, let me say this. I recently read something, and especially this sort of relationship of being chosen in. So Karl Barth, the great, Reformed theologian, said that Karl Barth made predestination, eternal election, the very heart of his entire construction of his theology.
Yeah.
And so said that in Jesus Christ, we have been called by, chosen by God. So we find our own chosenness by God reflected in Jesus Christ as the man for all other human beings. Yeah. So of course, then our response is to respond to that. So with predestination, it's this tension between what God has done, seemingly, well, both for us, but seemingly also beyond, what we have done, and our response to that. So it's the same thing as, if God has been graceful or shown grace to us, how do we respond to that? So I recently read this thing by Miroslav Volf, in which I thought, was just such a great understanding of this. And he made this comment. He said, inscribed in the very heart of God's grace is the rule that we can only be its recipients if we do not resist being made into its agents. So let me repeat that. Inscribed in the very heart of God's grace is the rule that we can be its recipients only if we do not resist being made into its agents. So you can see in that the grace, it is in the offering of grace where already the response is implicit. So and that is very much true about predestination as well, because God has chosen for us, and that lies at the very heart of the gospel and the Reformed understanding of that. Because God has chosen for us, therefore we can choose for God. So predestination, in other words, and I've already sort of suggested that, is really nothing but that one can replace that word chosen by the word love. God has loved us before we loved God. And of course, I mean, then one could add and say, okay, so what are the logical consequences of that? And those sort of tensions remain. But we know, in the same way as one cannot make sense of love by way of logics. Love transcends logics. So you can sort things out afterwards, and you can, perhaps, try to understand things, but there's no way. Love just doesn't allow itself to be rationally analyzed. And so in that sense, predestination is exactly like love. You can respond to it. So like, for instance, if you can imagine a situation where, a man, or you can reverse that situation, a man declares his love to a woman and she says, oh, really? How does that work? But that's not really the response to love, is it? The response to love is to embrace, to say, yes, thank you, wonderful. Yeah. So in terms of predestination as well, it is the offer of receiving an identity in someone else that is not based on my choice, that is not based on the strength of my love, that is not based on the strength of my dedication. And that is what predestination is about.
Wow. That has been fantastic. And I'll probably need to replay this about 4 times to think all this through. Thank you very much. It's really helpful. That's been really helpful to sort of explore it with a bit more depth than just a quick yes or no, but to explore it in the concept of where it sits. And also I did like hearing about where it sits in history. So
yeah, and I think that is really important because it is such a central, thing in Reformed theology, and that's, of course, I mean, I suspect most of the people in the Uniting Church would have, that background.
We're a Reformed church, yeah.
Exactly. And most people's identity would be, to a lesser or greater extent, shaped by that. And so once one understands where it comes from, you actually understand why it is an important thing in Reformed churches, and a wonderful thing as well. It's not this sort of crude or rude doctrine that it is often, a hard doctrine that it is often made to be. It really goes back to a wonderful sense of comfort that it is supposed to offer people.
Okay, I deeply appreciate you spending some time with us. Thank you so much.
That's a pleasure, Richard, and all the best for that conversation.